I have buried a good many men out on the Carrizo flats and shod the horses of more bad ones than I'd care to count. And in 50 years of swinging a hammer in lodestone, I learned that you can read a man's whole life in the way he hands you his reins. So when the stranger walked his gray into my barn that cold spring evening with a hole in his shoulder, he was pretending he didn't have. I knew two things before he said a word: that he had killed people, and that he was about done living. What I did not know, what nobody in that town knew, was that he had ridden in just in time to stand between Junia Calder and the worst morning lodestone ever woke to. But I am getting ahead of it, and the story does not belong to him first. It belongs to her. Junia Calder came to us a widow, and we never did learn the whole of where she'd come from, only that she'd lost a husband somewhere east on the trail, and had kept going west the way a creek keeps going downhill, because there was nowhere else for the water to run. She had a black bag and a wagon with a canvas top, and a way of looking at a sick man that made him feel he'd already started to mend. The first month she was among us, old Pearl Sykes took the lung fever that had carried off 2 grown men that same winter, and everybody had already dug the spot in their minds where Pearl would lie. Junia sat up with her 4 nights running, steaming her with kettles and some bitter green tea she brewed, and on the 5th morning Pearl asked for biscuits. After that, there was not a soul in Lodestone who'd hear a word against her. That is the thing you have to hold on to, because of what came later. Before they turned, they loved her. There was not a cabin on the flats she had not walked into in the black of night with that bag, not a child she had not pulled crying and read into the lamplight, not a fever she had not broken or a bone she had not set straight. She charged what folks could pay, and she charged nothing where there was nothing, and she never once made a man feel poor for the price of his own healing. Lodestone had never had a doctor who'd stay. The drink got them, or the loneliness did, and they drifted off down the Rio Seco to the next camp. Junia stayed. We thought she was ours. She lived in the little frame house at the end of Cedar Street that had been the assay office before the silver gave out, with a shingle she'd painted herself, JCALDER, midwife and physic, and a row of glass jars in the front window that caught the morning sun and threw it onto the boardwalk in long colored bars. The children used to stand in those bars of light and hold their hands up red and gold. I have thought about that 100 times since. The light coming through her window and the children's hands in it. Now Royce Stennett owned the country around Lodestone the way a hawk owns the air over a field. He'd come in before the war with nothing but a saddle and a hard streak, and by the time I'm telling you of, he had 40,000 acres of grass and water rights that pinched off 3 smaller men a year and a herd you couldn't ride around in a day. He had a big house out on the Sweetwater with real glass windows shipped up from the coast, and he had a young wife named Della that he'd married late, when he was gray and she was hardly more than a girl. And the strange and softening truth of Royce Stennett was that he loved that woman past all reason. You could see it in him. The hardest man on the Carrizo went gentle as new butter when Della came into a room. She had a laugh like water over stones, and she had wanted a baby more than she'd wanted to draw breath. And when at last she was carrying one, Stennett went around for months looking like a man who'd been forgiven something he hadn't known he'd done. It was Junia, of course, who tended her. There wasn't another soul within 50 miles who could, and Junia had told Stennett a thing back in the autumn that he did not want to hear, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to unhear, and that is the hinge the whole tragedy turns on, so mark it. She told him Della was made narrow and her blood ran thin and slow to clot, that she'd seen it once before in a woman on the trail, and that when Della's time came they would want more hands than 2, a real surgeon out of the territory capital if one could be got, sent for early and kept close. Stennett heard her say it. And Royce Stennett, who had never in his life paid another man to do a thing he believed he could buy his way around, said his wife would have the best, and the best was Junia Calder, and he'd hear no more talk of strangers cutting on her. He said it the way he said everything, like the matter was already settled by the saying. Junia let it lie. You did not argue twice with Royce Stennett. Once was as far as wisdom went. But she wrote it all down in that ledger she kept, every word, the way she wrote down everything, because she was the kind of woman who knew that someday the truth would need a place to have been standing all along. Della's time came in March, in the worst of the spring storms, with the wind throwing sleet flat across the flats and the Sweetwater running brown and high. A rider came pounding for Junia near midnight, and she went out into that weather without a second's hesitation, the way she always did, and that is the last anybody saw of the woman they loved before the woman they hated took her place, though she was the same woman the whole time, and never changed at all. It was only Lodestone that changed. I have pieced together what happened in that big house from the only two people who would talk about it after, and one of them was Junia herself, and the other was a serving woman named Tess, or who had been in the room the whole night, and who has more courage in her than most of the men I've known. The baby came hard, but the baby came, a girl, dark-haired, squalling, perfect. And then Della began to bleed, and would not stop. Junia did everything a body can do. She worked through to the gray of morning with her sleeves soaked to the shoulder and her hands cramping, and Tess Orr says she has never seen a human being fight harder for another human being's life than Junia Calder fought for Della Stenitz that night. But there are some doors that, once they open, no hand on earth can shut, and Della's was one of them. Junia had known it might be. She had told the woman's husband so in the autumn, and he had not sent for the surgeon, and now in the cold dawn light Della Stenitz slipped away with her new daughter on her breast and her young face gone smooth and easy, and the last clear thing she did in this world, Tess Orr swears on it, was put her hand against Junia's cheek and say, "Thank you. Mind my girl." Junia carried that baby out to Royce Stennett alive and breathing in her 2 arms and told him his wife was dead, and the man broke. I don't say it to excuse what he did after, for there is no excuse, but I have lived long enough to know that grief in a hard man is a fire in a dry barn. It does not stay where you set it down. He would not hold the child. He would not look at it. He looked at Junia Calder standing there with his living daughter in her arms and his dead wife in the next room, and somewhere in the wreck of him, a thing turned over that should have stayed buried, and he said, "Lo, you killed her." And then louder, so the riders in the yard could hear, "She walked in there well and you killed her." That was the beginning. A lie a powerful man tells loud enough, often enough in a frightened country becomes the air people breathe. I watched it happen over the next 8 days, and I want to tell you it happened slow, that Lodestone fought it, that the folks she'd healed stood up for her. Some did. Pearl Sykes did, and Tess Orr, and a few others, and they paid for it in cold shoulders and worse. But fear is a contagion faster than any fever Junia ever broke, and Royce Stennett had every man on the flats either in his debt or under his shadow. He didn't have to threaten. He just had to grieve out loud, and let the men who wanted his goodwill draw their own conclusions about what a man does for a friend whose wife has been, as he kept saying it, butchered. There was a preacher then, a thin shouting man named Brother Coyle who'd come to us off a wagon and never quite found the bottom of his own anger, and he took Stennett's grief and made a doctrine of it. Which was the word he reached for first, the way small men always reach back for the oldest fear in the box. A woman alone, who knew the inside of the body, who brewed bitter things in glass jars. Brother Coyle could make a sermon out of that, and he did, 2 Sundays running, and by the second Sunday the colored bars of light through Junia's window had stones thrown through them, and somebody had painted a word on her door I won't repeat. And the children didn't come to stand in the light anymore. She didn't run. That was the thing about her that the town, in its fever, couldn't fathom, and that I think only a Sarin ever fully understood, because it was the same iron that was in him. They expected her to load the wagon in the night and slip off down the Rio Seco like every other healer Lodestone had ever had. Instead, she kept her shingle up. She walked to the store with her chin level and bought her flour and bore the silence. When a child took croup on the south edge of town the 3rd night, the family was too afraid to send for her, and she heard the coughing on the wind anyway and went. And they let her in because a mother will take the devil's own help before she'll watch her baby choke. and Junia broke the croup and walked home in the dark and never said a word about it to a living soul. I only know because the mother told me, years on, crying. It was in the middle of that bad week that the stranger came into my barn. I'd had a feeling about it being a bad spring even before he showed. There'd been talk down the trail of a stage robbed up near the Carrizo rim, the guard shot, the strongbox gone, and the country was jumpy with it. So when a tall man on a good gray gelding walked in at dusk holding his left arm a hair too still and asked could he stable the horse, and was there a doctor in this town, I had my thoughts and I kept them behind my teeth, which is a thing 50 years of horseshoeing teaches you to do. He was lean and weathered and somewhere past 40, with eyes the color of creek ice and a gun tied down low on his right leg, the way only one kind of man wears it. He paid me in coin, good coin, and he didn't haggle, and when I told him there was no doctor but there was a healer woman down on Cedar Street, his face did something small and tired, like he'd hoped for an answer that would let him keep moving and hadn't gotten it. Cedar Street, asterisk, he said, and that was about the sum of our talk that night. But I noticed, when he eased the saddle off the gray, that the inside of his coat was dark and stiff, and that he favored that arm the way a man favors a thing that's gone past hurting into the cold, numb place where it starts to be dangerous. I didn't ask. He didn't tell. He went off down Cedar Street in the dark, and I banked my fire, and I thought, there goes a man hunting his own grave and not in any hurry to find it. What passed in Junia's house that night I had from her much later, when she could speak of it with the bad parts smoothed down. She told me she'd been sitting up alone. She did not sleep much that week, with the town's hate pressing on her windows like weather, and there'd come a knock, not the frantic knock of a birth or a fever, but a slow, careful, deliberate knock, the knock of a man who has decided something. She opened the door on a stranger gray in the face with a pistol on his hip, and she did not flinch, because by then she was past flinching at much. I'm shot, he said. Through the meat, top of the shoulder. 2 days back. It's gone hot. And Junia Calder, whom that very town was calling murderous, looked at the killer's gun and the killer's fever-bright eyes and stepped back and said, then you'd best come in before you fall down on my step. She didn't ask who'd shot him or who he'd shot. She told me that plainly, and when I asked her why not, she gave me a look I have never forgotten. Harlan, asterisk, she said, a wound doesn't have a side. It's just a wound. You close it or you don't. And I have thought since that this is the nearest thing to a creed I ever heard a human being say out loud, and that it is a better one than Brother Coyle ever shouted from his box. She had the bullet out of him by lamplight before the church bell rang midnight. He dug at it himself on the trail and made a worse mess of it than the bullet had, and the rot had set in, and Tess Orr, who'd taken to staying nights with Junia that week, for their safety of a kind in two, held the lamp while Junia laid the arm open clean and drew the poison and the lead, and packed it with the green paste she made, and sewed him shut with horsehair and a hand that did not shake. He'd refused the laudanum. Said he wanted to keep his eyes open. So he sat there and sweated and gripped the chair arm with his good hand and watched a woman the whole world had told him was a witch save the use of his arm and very likely his life. And Junia said that somewhere in the middle of it, when the worst of the cutting was done, he looked at her steady through the fever and said the first soft thing she'd heard from any quarter in 8 days. He said, "You've got steady hands for a hunted woman." And Junia said back, not looking up from her sewing, "And you've got a quiet mouth for a man being cut on. We'll both do." He stayed 3 days in her back room, mending, and in those 3 days a thing grew up between Junia Calder and a siren that the rest of the town's noise could not get into. I think it was the simplest thing in the world and the rarest. She did not look at him and see a killer. He did not look at her and see a witch. Each of them had been made into a story by other people's fear, and each of them, alone in that little house with the stones already through the window glass, was just exactly tired enough of the story to set it down and be the actual person underneath. She fed him broth and changed his dressings and went about her work. He sat where he could watch the street through the broken window, and he cleaned his gun once a day slow, and he didn't say much, but he watched her. And on the second day, when a clutch of men went by the house spitting and one of them threw a clod of dirt at the door, I am told, Asa, Ren rose up out of that chair white as a sheet with his fever and laid his hand on his gun before he'd hardly thought, and Junia said, without turning around, "Sit down. They're nothing. They're just frightened, and frightened isn't worth a bullet." And he sat down. But Tess Orr told me that was the moment she knew, watching his face, that whatever the town had decided to do to Junia Calder, it would now have to come through this man first, and that the town did not yet know what it had wandered up against. Because here is the truth of Asa Ren that I came to know in the years after, when he'd talk a little late with the work done. He had had a wife once, and a child, a long way back and a long time gone. He'd been a hard young man with a fast hand, and he'd hired that hand out to men who paid for hard things done, and he'd been off doing one of those things. He never would say what, when a fever came through the little place where he'd left his family safe, or thought he had, and took them both inside of a week while he was 300 miles away earning blood money to keep them in comfort. By the time he got home, there were 2 graves and a neighbor who wouldn't meet his eye. And Asa Ren had spent every year since then riding and selling that fast hand and waiting without much hurry for somebody quicker to put him in the ground beside the family he hadn't been there to save. He told me once that he'd come to think a man like him didn't get to mend anything, that all he was good for was the breaking, and that the kindest thing the world could do was let him go down doing the one thing he was made for. That was the man who knocked on Junia Calder's door. And the thing she did, without meaning to, without even knowing his name, was mend him. She put her healing hands into a wound he'd given up on, and she closed it, and somewhere under the horsehair stitches a thing in Asa Ren that had been gone a long time came creeping back. He'd found, after all those years, a thing worth standing for. He just didn't have the word for it yet, and there wasn't going to be much time. The trouble came to a head over the child. Stennett, in the wreck of his grief, had given the baby, Della's living daughter, over to Tess Orr's sister to wet nurse, and would not look at her. And the country took its cue from him, as the country always did, and a thing began to be said that was even worse than witch. They began to say that the baby ought never to have lived if the mother had to die for it, that there was something unnatural in it, that the healer had chosen the child over the wife, had traded a Stennett's life for a, and here Brother Coyle would lower his voice in a way meant to be heard, for a asterisk bastards. Which was a foul thing to say of a dead man's lawful daughter, and a fouler thing to build a killing on, but it was said, and it spread. And on the 8th day Royce Stennett rode into Lodestone at the head of a dozen of his men with a face like a cliff before a slide, and went into the saloon, and did not come out, and the lamps burned late. And I stood in my barn door in the dark listening to the low, ugly murmur of a town talking itself into something, and I knew, the way you know weather, that the morning was going to be bad. I will tell you the one decent thing I did in the whole affair, and it isn't much. Around 2 in the morning I couldn't stand it, and I walked down Cedar Street and knocked soft on Junia's door, and when she opened it I said, "Junia, they're working themselves up at Prout's. Stennett and all his crew and half the fools in town. You ought not to be here come light." And she looked at me, calm as still water, and she said, "And where ought I to be, Harlan?" "Running down the Rio Seco in the dark like I did this thing they say I did." And I didn't have an answer, because the truth was she'd done nothing, and a person who has done nothing has a terrible kind of freedom. They have nothing to run from, and so running would be its own confession, and Junia Calder was not going to confess to a thing she hadn't done to save her own neck, not if the whole flats came for her. I see now it was the bravest thing I ever stood next to. At the time I just thought she was a stubborn woman about to get herself killed. I turned to go, miserable, and from the dark of the back room a quiet voice I didn't know yet said, "She won't be alone, old man. Go on home." And I went, and I did not sleep, and I have wondered ever since whether I should have done more, and I have decided that there was nothing more for me to do, because the thing that needed doing that morning needed a man who'd already made his peace with dying, and that was never going to be me. It was going to be him. They came at dawn. I was up who could sleep, and I stood in my barn door in the gray light and watched them come up the middle of the street, 30 or 40 of them by then, for a mob grows in the dark like bread, and at the front of it rode Royce Stennett on his big black horse, and beside him strode Brother Coyle with a Bible in one hand and a lantern in the other, though the sun was coming, and there were ropes, and there were torches that nobody had quite decided yet what they were for. And there was that low animal sound a crowd makes when it has stopped being people and become a single frightened, furious thing. Marshal Prout came out of his office and looked at the size of it and looked at who was leading it and went back inside and shut the door, and I have never forgiven him for that, and I never will. They stopped in front of Junia's house. The colored jars still stood in her window, what the stones had left of them, and the early sun was just coming up over the Carrizo rim and starting to throw those long bars of red and gold light out across the boardwalk, the way it did every morning, indifferent as God. And Junia Calder opened her own front door and stepped out onto her own porch to meet them, in her gray dress with her chin level and her hands folded in front of her, and she did not say a word. She just stood there and let them look at her, one woman against 40 men, and the silence of her was louder than all of them. Stennett's voice came down off his horse like a rockfall. "You've got till I count 10 to come down off that porch, witch." And Brother Coyle started in over the top of him, shouting his scripture twisted into a noose, and the crowd sound rose, and a man near the back threw a bottle that smashed on the porch post by Junia's head, and she did not move, did not so much as blink, and I thought, this is it, this is the morning, and I started forward with no plan in my head and no weapon in my hand and my old heart going like a hammer on an anvil. And that is when the gunfighter came off the porch rail where he'd been sitting in the shadow the whole while, where not one of them had seen him, and stepped down into the strip of colored morning light between Junia Calder and the mob, and said one word. Enough. He didn't shout it. That was the thing. 40 men were roaring, and one quiet man said one quiet word, and the whole street went still as a held breath, because there are some men whose stillness carries farther than other men's noise, and Asa Wren was one of them. He stood there easy in the red-gold light with his thumbs hooked in his belt and that tied-down gun riding on his hip, and he looked the mob over slow, face by face, the way a man counts cattle, and when he had looked at all of them he spoke again, still quiet, and every soul on that street strained to hear it. "I don't know but 2 or 3 of you asterisk," he said, "and you don't know me at all, so I'll tell you so there's no confusion later. My name is Asa Wren." I watched it go through the crowd like cold water poured down a collar. There were men there who'd heard that name down the trail, and the ones who'd heard it told the ones who hadn't, in whispers, and you could see the front rank of the mob lose about a foot of ground without a single boot moving, the way a wave pulls back off the sand before it knows it's going to. "This woman," Asa went on, "cut a bullet out of me 4 nights ago and didn't ask whose it was or whose I was. She's got hands steadier than any of you've got nerve. Now you've come up the street here in the dark with your ropes and your good book to hang her for the crime of being the only one among you with the spine to walk into a dying woman's room and the skill to try and save her." He let that sit. "I've killed men," he said, and he said it plain, not boasting, the way you'd say you dug a well. "More than I'll answer for, and I have never once in my life killed anybody for trying to save somebody. That's about the only clean ground I've got left to stand on, and I'm standing on it. So here's where it is, friends. You want her, you'll come through me, and I'll take down more of you than this town can bury proper before you do." Royce Stennett heeled his black horse forward 2 steps and looked down at the gunfighter from the height of his saddle and the height of his 40,000 acres and said, "I'll pay you double whatever she did, gun hand, to ride out of my country right now and let decent men finish their business." And Asa Wren looked up at him for a long moment, and then he did a thing I did not expect and never forgot. He laughed, soft and without any joy in it, just a dry, weathered sound. "Mr. Asterisk," he said, "I have spent 20 years taking money off men like you to do their killing. You're the first one ever offered to pay me for the killing I'd want to do for free." The laugh went out of him, but I'm not for sale this morning. There's a thing about her hands you don't know yet, and you're about to find out it cost you everything. And when you do, you're going to wish to God somebody'd stood in front of you before you got it said out loud where you can't take it back. So I'm going to stand here, and you're going to go home. Both of those things are going to happen. The only thing left to decide is how many of these fools behind you live to see noon. It hung there. The whole flats hung there in the dawn light. I have been close to death a few times in my long life, and I have never felt a thing as heavy as that street felt in that minute, with the sun coming up red over the rim and 40 men breathing, and one woman standing still as a saint behind one quiet killer who decided this was the hill. Stennett's hand drifted toward the rifle on his saddle. Asa Wren's hand did not move at all, which was somehow worse, and every man who knew the name knew why, and the front rank lost another foot. And then into that terrible balance, a voice rang out from the side of the street, high and shaking and absolutely unafraid, and it was Tess Orr. "He's right," she cried. "There's a thing you don't know, Royce Stennett, and I'll not stand here and watch you hang her for it. I was in that room. I was in that room the whole night and you were not, and I'll tell every soul here what your wife said with her last breath, and I'll tell them what Junia Calder told you last autumn that you wouldn't hear." The crowd's head turned like a single animal's, and Tess Orr, God keep her, walked out into the middle of that street with her sister behind her, and her sister was carrying the baby, Della's daughter, 4 weeks old and wrapped in white, blinking in the new light, and Tess held up Junia's ledger over her head where they could all see it, the ledger where Junia wrote everything down, every word, against the day the truth would need a place to have been standing all along. "Last fall," Tess said, and her voice steadied as she went, the way a voice does when it's finally saying the thing it was made to say, "Junia Calder warned this man that his wife was made too narrow and her blood too thin, and that when her time came she'd need a surgeon sent for out of the territory, kept close, weeks ahead. It's wrote here in her own hand, and she read it to me the night it happened so I'd remember. And Royce Stennett said no. Said his wife would have the best, and the best was right here, and he'd hear no talk of strangers. You said it, Royce. In your own parlor, I poured the coffee. You said no." The street made a sound then, low, and it was a different sound than before. Stennett had gone the color of ash. "And that night," Tess went on, and now there were tears running down her face, but her voice never broke. "That night this woman worked from midnight to dawn with her arms red to the shoulder and never stopped, never once, fighting for Della when there wasn't a doctor in 300 miles could have done one thing more because you wouldn't send for one. And Della knew it. Della knew whose fault it wasn't. The last thing your wife did in this world," Royce Stennett with her own hand, "was touch Junia Calder's face and thank her and say, 'Mind my girl. Mind my girl.' And Junia carried that girl out to you alive, your daughter, your living daughter that this woman saved, and you wouldn't hold her. You haven't held her yet. She's right here. She's been right here the whole time you've been building a hanging." And Tess Orr's sister stepped forward and held the baby up, and the dawn light fell on that small, blinking face, and 40 men who had come to do murder looked at the living child at the heart of the thing they'd been told to hate, and the mob, the single frightened, furious animal of it, came apart back into people. You could watch it happen. Men looked at the baby and looked at the ledger and looked at the gunfighter standing easy in the light and looked, finally, at each other, the way men do when they've woken up somewhere they're ashamed to be. And the ropes started to go behind backs, and the torches got lowered, and Brother Coyle opened his mouth to start shouting again, and not one man would meet his eye, and his voice ran out of him like water out of a cracked jug. But it was Stennett I was watching. Royce Stennett sat his black horse in the middle of the street and looked at his daughter's face in the morning light, the daughter he had not once looked at, and I watched the cliff of the man come down all at once the way a cutbank goes when the river's been at it long enough, all in a slide, all at once, soundless. He got down off that horse like an old man, though he wasn't so old, and he walked across the street through the crowd that parted for him, and he stood in front of Tess Orr's sister and the child, and his big hard murdering hands came up and they were shaking like a boy's, and he took his daughter, and he held her against his chest, and Roy Stennett, who owned the whole Carrizo country and had buried his heart with his wife, and tried to bury an innocent woman besides, put his gray head down over that baby and wept in front of 40 men, and not one of them ever after said a word about it, because some grief you give a man the privacy of even when it's standing in the open street. He turned to Junia at last with the child in his arms, and he could not get the words out at first, and when they came rough as gravel. "I said you killed her," he said. "I said it loud, and I made the whole country say it, and it was a lie, and the truth is I killed her, with my own pride, last fall in my own parlor when you told me what she needed and I was too." He couldn't finish. "I'll never make this right," he said. "There's no making it right. But I'll spend what's left of me trying, and the first of it is this. There's not a man on these flats will ever again say a word against Junia Calder, not while I draw breath, and any that does will answer to me with everything I've got, and I've got a great deal." He looked around at them all when he said it, and there was the old iron in it, but turned now for once to a clean purpose. Then he looked back at her, broken and plain. "Can you ever—" he started and stopped. "No, asterisk," he said. "That's not a thing to ask. I'll just be grateful, and I'll be sorry till I die." And Junia Calder came down off her porch then for the first time, through the bars of colored light, and walked up to the man who had nearly gotten her killed, and she looked at him a long moment, and then she reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one finger, those steady hands, and she said, gentle as anything, "Her name's been waiting on you, Royce." Della picked it before she went. She wanted her called Grace. And the big man's face came apart all over again, quieter this time, and that was the whole of Junia's vengeance on the man who'd raised a mob against her. She gave him his wife's last gift and his daughter's name, and let him keep his grief without the extra weight of her hatred on top of it. "I told you she was the bravest thing I ever stood next to. I did not say the half of it." The crowd melted away. Men who an hour before had carried ropes now couldn't get gone fast enough, and a few of them, the better ones, stopped to take off their hats to her as they went, mumbling, and she took it the way she took everything, level and without triumph. Brother Coyle was on the next stage south, and Lodestone was glad to buy his ticket. Marshal Prout found his spine about a week too late, and nobody ever again let him forget the morning he locked his door. And the children came back to stand in the colored light through Junia's window, and hold their red and gold hands up in it, and I would see Roy Stennett's buggy come into town twice a week from then on, and the man himself carry little Grace up Cedar Street to the healer's house so the woman who'd saved her could see how she grew. He did try to make it right, in the end, the only ways grief lets a man try, and Junia let him, which was its own kind of grace, the kind that costs the one who gives it. Through all of it, a siren had stood in the middle of the street, and when it was over and the people gone, he was still standing there, in the place between where the mob had been and where Junia had been, like a man who'd done the one thing he came into the world to do and didn't quite know what a body was supposed to do after. Junia walked back to him through the morning light. The two of them stood there a minute. I was close enough to hear it, and I've never told it to anyone till now, because some things you keep. "You could have ridden out," she said. "He offered you good money too." "I know it," Asa said. "Why didn't you?" And Asa looked at her, that hard creek-ice face with 20 years of killing in it and something new working its way up underneath, and he said, "Ma'am, I have spent my whole life being the thing folks like that send for when they want somebody hurt. I figured, just the once, before I'm done, I'd like to be the thing that stands in front of the hurt instead. You gave me that. You didn't even know my name, and you gave me that." He looked down at his hands, the ones that had killed more men than he'd answer for, the ones she'd sewn back together by lamplight. "Reckon I owed you a debt for the arm," he said, "and I've paid out a lot of debts in my time, but that's the first one I ever paid that left me feeling like I had more than I started with." And Junia Calder, who had buried a husband and saved a town that tried to hang her and given away her own vengeance for free, looked at this used-up, dangerous, tender man standing in the colored light of her broken window, and she did the bravest small thing of all the brave things she did that spring. She put out her steady hand, the one she healed with, and she laid it flat against his chest, over the heart he'd told her was buried, and she felt it beating there same as anybody's. And she said, "Then you'd best come in and let me look at that arm before you ruin all my good sewing." And after that, Ren, I expect we ought to talk about whether a man who's done with the breaking might find something around here worth the mending. He did not ride out. That's the end of it and the whole of it. He hung the gun belt on a peg inside her door the next morning. I was there. I'd come to see was she all right. And I saw him do it. Saw him loop that tied-down gun over a wooden peg by the door like a man hanging up a hat he didn't mean to wear again. And so far as I know, he never took it down in anger but the once more, years on, against a wolf at the stock. And that's a different story and a small one. He learned to put up hay and he learned to gentle horses, which he had a gift for, the same quiet a horse can feel in a man. And folks who didn't know him took him for nothing but a rancher's hired hand grown into a husband, which suited him fine, for he'd had enough of his old name to last him. They married in the fall, in the little frame house at the end of Cedar Street, with Pearl Sykes and Tess Orr and her sister there. And Royce Stennett standing at the back with Grace in his arms, because Junia had asked him to come, and he had wept when she asked, and said he didn't deserve to be let in the door, and Junia had said nobody deserves anything, Royce. That's why they call it Grace, and named your girl right. They had years. Not enough, there are never enough, but real ones, ordinary ones, the kind that don't make a story because nothing in them needs surviving. She healed and he ranched, and the children of Lodestone grew up and brought their own children to stand in the colored light. And the town that had tried to hang Junia Calder in the dawn came, over time, to talk about her the way you'd talk about a saint, which she'd have hated, being a practical woman who knew exactly how much luck and how much horsehair went into the things they called miracles. I'm an old man now, the oldest thing left in Lodestone, and most of the folk in this telling are out under the Carrizo grass, Junia and Asa among them, side by side, with a single stone she'd have called a foolishness, and he'd have called about right. I shod his gray for 20 years, and I'll tell you the gelding outlived the both of them and died fat in a green pasture, which is more than most of us manage. But here is the thing I come back to, all these years on, the picture that stays when the rest goes soft. It's that dawn. 40 men come up the street in the dark with ropes, and one woman on her porch who would not run because she'd done nothing to run from, and one used-up killer who decided that, for once in his ruined life, he would stand in front of the hurt instead of behind it, and the early sun coming up red over the rim, indifferent as God, and throwing those long bars of colored light out of her glass jars across the boardwalk, the same light the children used to stand in. That's where Ren stepped down to meet them, right into the colored light between the woman and the mob. And he said one quiet word, and the morning that should have been the worst Lodestone ever woke to turned, on the strength of one quiet word and one brave girl with a ledger and a baby in the light. Into the morning we got our healer back, and a hard man found a reason to set the gun down, and a grieving man got his daughter's name. Enough, he said, and it was. Lord help me, it was just exactly enough.